Thank you. Thank you so much, Lucas, and my Sonic Axe friends. Indeed, it's been a real privilege to be in the background of this event for some time, and it's an exciting role to be kicking off the discussion and thinking about this question of the Sonic Axe Academy. I looked up, I pulled out an old folder that I had for Sonic Axe Festival at home, and I'd scribbled SAFE, meaning Sonic Axe Festival, on it, and I had this sitting on my desk, and I realized that the last thing that I felt was safe, that this feels like very slippery ground, and I think the fact that we're in the Brakke Grond is probably quite appropriate. Why an academy, justification and provocation? Well, I think this whole attempt at trying to put some stuff out there for us to discuss is something of a combined justification and provocation. So I'll be constantly bringing up terms that I'll try and pull together in some way. I'm kind of thinking on the hoof. There's been an immense amount of work on the part of the whole team, and I feel very much part of the team in trying to work out the sorts of issues and questions that need to be foregrounded. And it's extremely hard to see how to pitch them. So you'll forgive me if this is characteristically slightly grasshopper-ish. But I think we're in a domain of very exploratory activity, and I am going to throw up quite a few quotes as hitching posts for us. I realize we'll have lots of fantastic audio-visual materials over the next couple of days. I'm going to throw up some quite sober slides and quotes. So the first one is from Hans-Jörg Reinberger, the philosopher of science, who was interviewed by Michael Schwab for his book on experimental systems. And I like Reinberger's definition of exploratory activity. It's in the space of bricolage, and it's dangerous. It's in slippery ground. It's unsecured. And these spaces are bounded and contained as exploratory spaces. And at the same time, our everyday life and our societies depend on them. So Reinberger is very clearly positioned as a philosopher and historian of science in his writings. But it's interesting to see how he engages this philosophy and this ethic when he's caught up in a discussion on art as an experimental system. And I think if we're talking about Sonic Axe Academy and places for experimentation, this is the kind of thing that we're probably wanting and needing to focus on. Artistic research, obviously, in my professorial role, I'm quite engaged with it. I supervise and examine and mentor PhD arts practitioners. And also I was involved in founding an interdisciplinary research lab in Newcastle. But the other thing perhaps that's equally important to that academic side of my past is that I ran an art school in France for 6 years. And the art schools in France were and still are, although to a lesser degree now, quite adamantly separated from the university academic kinds of sectors of activity. And these sorts of mixes in activities are things I will be drawing on, not out of self-indulgence, but because I think that we can only dialogue if we know where we're respectively speaking from. We can only relate to something or to someone insofar as we are ourselves identifiably speaking from somewhere. So these mixed backgrounds are going to feed into the points I'm going to try and make. And perhaps somebody who sums this up beautifully is Donna Haraway when she talks about situated knowledges. So she talks about the epistemologies and politics of location and positioning. She talks about getting around the myth of the God's eye trick, the universalist myth, where you can see everything in a very top-down, generic fashion. Whereas what is needed is positioning, is situatedness, and is respect for the positioning and situatedness of others. So I think this question of how an initiative like an Academy for Exploratory Systems or for exploratory knowledge building, which is going to be roaming, it's going to be extreme in that it's pushing the boundaries of what might previously have been considered situated. This question of how we start, what's our starting point, I think is a really important one. And of course, there are as many starting points as there are people in this room, so it's a complex one. We're seeking a larger vision, and we need to be mindful of the somewhere in particular in which we're located today. So there's a paradox here. There's a risk. In order to adopt one identifiable position, in order to be addressable, literally, we relinquish other positions. When you become something, when you position yourself somewhere, then you're no longer somewhere else. So it's a matter of making a choice. You invest in one area and you divest in others, disinvest. And you make a choice and you assume a responsibility, an ability to answer for yourself, the literal sense of responsibility. And I think this is what we're here to discuss. So I've been trying to identify open issues, and these generally boil down to unanswerable questions, like how do artists talk about how and why they make and show their work? How can we develop new kinds of interfaces between artists and the education system, or indeed alternative approaches to art education? And how can we encourage effective critical reflection in our artistic and cultural system? And I should say that these questions, in a way, have been co-forged through numerous Skype discussions with Lucas and Gideon and Rosa. So I'm borrowing some terms also. The meandering, multi-layered complexities of the cultural systems in which we're thinking about setting up an academy are obviously something we need to take into account. And this has been very clear through our discussions. Another couple of questions are, how can we articulate artistic research without falling into the sterile oppositions of theory versus practice? Okay, it's an old question, but I think that doesn't mean that we shouldn't restate it. And how to maintain the vital independence of artistic research and at the same time engage productively with ideas, with practices being developed elsewhere. So I see these questions as kind of high energy questions, which is why I've put the gravitational waves image, or one of the multiple renderings of it, in the background. In thinking about these, there's one term that's cropped up repeatedly, for me anyway, which is the notion of legitimacy. So first of all, there's a purely pragmatic aspect to this notion, which is, how can you make artistic research a legitimate livelihood? How can you make it into an employable, remunerated activity? This is really, really brass tacks. But it's a tricky point, because the main way that artists make a living, if they want to avoid the serial subsidy searches and the art market, is by teaching and mentoring. That's a question of transmitting specific skills, having them recognized so that they're transmissible in formal teaching and mentoring contexts. That way they can become professional. But the places that they can do this, universities and art schools and conservatories that are increasingly caught up in European requirements, are more and more prioritizing PhD holders to teach the arts. So this is a double-edged sword, and this is where my work, perhaps in the French art school, is something I can't forget. I think it's very positive in some ways for artists to engage with research in contexts where they can develop collegial inquiry, where they can acquire methodological and discursive skills that give them useful distance from their own practice and a useful understanding of their own practice and ability to situate it more broadly. So I set up what they call in France a troisième cycle, a doctoral program in the École supérieure de l'image in Angoulême and Poitiers. This was 15 years ago. And conservative staff members in the school wanted to lynch me. This was considered as high treason because they'd always seen the universities as the enemy of the art school. Universities were dry, practice-bereft forms of knowledge, whereas art schools vindicated their freedom and their need to develop artists and to accompany artists through hands-on pragmatic training. But at the same time, a space for a different kind of more structured reflection was sought by the younger staff members. It's not an age thing. Young is a question of mindset, right? And by graduates who'd spent 5 years in the school. They'd got a Diplôme National des Arts Plastiques and Diplôme National Supérieur. And they were looking for a more structured and mentored context so that they could learn to think differently about their work and push it differently in the ways that interested them. And I thought it was important to set this up. And I've been talking with artist friends about this academy for quite some months. One of them is somebody I think is wonderful as both an artist and a teacher. This is Graham Harwood. He's currently at Goldsmiths, but I've known him for about 25 years. And Harwood emphasizes the value of a formal academic research context in order to learn to employ recognizable methods to operate in and to relate to different kinds of critical spaces. And when he speaks more broadly about his work, he doesn't really like talking about artistic research, but he prefers to talk about art as inquiry, as a mode of conduct, more than a process, and certainly not as an object. So this is the ethic that currently drives Yoha, that's Graham and his partner Matsuko Yokokoji. It drives their work, like this particular piece, which is ongoing, the RECT Thames Estuary Citizen Science Project, in collaboration with Critical Art Ensemble, Arts Catalyst, the local artists Andy Freeman and Fran Gallardo, as well as a bunch of local ecologists, fishermen, ex-industrialists, engineers, interest groups, and so on, and the general public in Southend. And Harwood talks about this inquiry process as being fundamental. The filmmakers he's working with, for example, when they take a camera into the field, they're using it more as a trigger for interesting phenomena, a way of revealing and inciting and encouraging exchanges, a lens, literally, that allows them to view and engage with things differently, than as a means to make a film, make some kind of spectacular product. But this is really tricky because ultimately, as Graham says, what people will see, what's left at the end of this, and what will be valued from the art project is, ironically, the film, the product. So we're stuck with the object, just as I'm stuck with lifting these images from Yoha's website to evoke it. And another project they've got ongoing is this one called Database Addiction, where they're working with an NHS service that's engaged with drug abuse. And they're using art, again, as a method of inquiry to open up discussion amongst people trying to integrate some extremely complex issues related to their uses of professional databases in the kind of epidemiological and kind of monitoring roles that they have. And these people are having to engage with some really complex abstract processes, with governance issues, with privacy issues, and with broader health and public know-how issues. And they don't have a chance to step back and work out how this massively powerful system might be influencing them in their execution of everyday tasks. They're too caught up in their day jobs. So in this case, Harwood sees a method of inquiry as a way of offering a different terrain for developing unusual, tangential, totally personal and subjective readings of a system that's far too complex to lend itself to any kinds of useful representations. So these are the notions of inquiry that Harwood values. And he says that picking up methodological and discursive skills in a formal academic research context is something that's allowed him to move more freely in situations like these and to develop the kind of ethic that for him characterizes art. Somebody else I've been talking to about these questions is Christina Anderson from STEM, who describes herself as a researcher storyteller. And Christina sees artistic research as a specific kind of openness, a matter of setting up what she calls a system for paying attention. I haven't asked Christina's authorization to pull up this, this photo, but this is actually at Brighton University. She was doing a workshop with their music students. She does many of these hands-on workshops. But a system for paying attention is something that an artist builds not knowing exactly what they're paying attention to, not knowing exactly what they might find, otherwise there would be no exploratory, dangerously exploratory activity involved. So not really knowing what they're looking for. But a system for paying attention in the artistic sense is something that means that you might and are actually quite likely to find a bunch of other things you'd never have expected. So artistic research is about paying attention to the unexpected in one's own work and in the systems that one devises as an integral part of that work. It sounds quite circuitous, but actually what it's designating, I think, is a very open state. One becomes mindful of many different kinds of agency, including the agency of other people, although also of other things. Much of Christina's artistic research involves engagement with people from what she calls hard-nosed science, so from computing, she works a lot in HCI, and from industry. And she finds this helpful because it obliges her to describe what she's doing in an almost naive way. Just as having to acquire ethics approval for a project can be a healthy obligation to view one's research from totally different, otherwise unimagined perspectives. So these are kind of reflections on the ways that engaging with different sectors as an artist, as somebody doing artistic research, can be salutary. A lot of arts practitioners in universities will gripe about having to go through the ethics approval system, and I certainly know that some of the people I'm working with have these problems. But at the same time, seeing this as a necessity to situate oneself and one's practice with regard to the demands and the expectations and the cultures of others is perhaps not such a negative thing. So on a more negative side, though, obviously the question of academically legitimated artistic research has its very dark side. The fact that PhDs are becoming determinant for employability in the education sector is something that's quite ruthlessly exploited by some institutions as an income generator. Through doctoral programs that train artists to wrap knowledgeable discourse, often obscure bits of fashionable theory, around fragile, fledgling, or frankly dismally unoriginal artistic work. And this is a real problem. And of course, in places like the UK, which are high fee-paying with respect to continental practices, this is a very, very big problem. And the question of wrapping art in fashionable discourse is an intriguing one. I think it's really important to be able to mobilize emerging theory, original, strong, emerging theory into one's work if it gives you a better handle on your own ideas. I mean, I do it as much as anybody else. At the same time, when we're dealing with artistic research, I think it's all the more important to think about what gives these reference works their specific usefulness and how it is that they actually strengthen artistic research. Especially academic peer review is biased towards theory it sees as robustly established scholarship. So this can actually be in some quite interesting areas, media theory, feminist and science and technology studies, for example. But the danger there is that the references that are being mobilized may be read literally as substitutes for the art practices that they're meant to be supporting if we're not careful, if we're in this kind of pipeline of these income-generating doctoral programs. So there's an issue, I think, with structures that trade on artistic dreams of secure academic professions by extorting high fees, often making under or underpaid shadow supervisors do the real work for overpaid managers who spend their time ring-fencing validation procedures. They work in closed expert circles. Again, setting up vivas is a political exercise anywhere. And I would say in this environment where you've got people with very, very different values systems engaging in intellectual and artistic effort, it's a really, really, it's a knotty one. The fact that some of the survivors of these perverse systems are brilliant is what sustains them. I mean, the systems, not the people, right? But there are others who gain little intellectually or pedagogically and who lose whatever artistic drive they might have had in the first place. And they may well be hired to replace respected artist teachers who've not joined the PhD race. I realize I'm generalizing and I'm caricaturing because I know also that, well, from having run this art school in France, that there were some people who would never really try to engage with any kind of more challenging areas of intellectual or artistic pursuit because they were very happily public servants just watching the clock tick towards their retirement dates. So not all people who don't join the PhD race are thwarted Mozarts, but you know, it's interesting to see that today with this accent on professional qualifications, some people being ousted, I feel shouldn't be. It's wrong. So I will move on from this artistic research PhD question because I realize it's not the sole focus of our being here, but of course coming from my current tricky academic, ambiguous academic position, I can't not evoke it, and I know a lot of people here are involved with it. I do want to throw in a more positive reference to programs that have actually put to very good use academic incentives to engage not just with other disciplines, but with broader swathes of the community. So in my home country, Aotearoa, New Zealand, I have colleagues who've set up some really interesting work at the Auckland University of Technology, as opposed to the Auckland University, which is closer to the Ivy League side of the scale. The University of Technology, like the UK Polytechnics, is perhaps more vocationally grounded, and they have a very, very large community of Polynesian, Asian scholars coming into doctoral programs with very, very different backgrounds. And I love this. The book is amazing. It's a collection of texts by a lot of these scholars and their teachers. But this question of traditional candidates, the fact that they're often familiar with the uncertainty and the marginality of knowledge that's typical of emerging research fields and disciplines. And they've often learned to question apparent givens long before they arrive in the academy. They have an extended experience, often with alienation, and this has helped them develop independence and allows them to bring to their project ways of knowing that are novel in the academy. So I'm thinking of a Samoan guy who's done some fantastic work on traditional Samoan architecture for reflecting on space. And so he's not just throwing together the latest human geography readings, although he's able to mobilize those really wonderfully. He's thinking very deeply about ancestral and tribal and hereditary notions of space and proxemics. And these kinds of insights are a wonderful wake-up call for doctoral communities that might otherwise become a little bit too incestuously closed. So the question of how artistic research is legitimated, it has its conceptual aspects as well as these pragmatic professionalization and legitimacy recognition aspects. right from the words that we're using to define it. There's meta-artistic research, of course, superficially about or on or derived from art, the kind of research that we find in art history and art and cultural theory. And at the same time, what we're looking at, I think, with the Sonic X Academy is to find ways to legitimate work that's as close to the bone of artistic practice as possible, and that's moreover not necessarily dominated by text values, however important they may be. Our linguistic and cognitive behaviors, the ways we think and act and express ourselves, are profoundly entangled, but it's not because we can't easily disentangle them that we have to accept formal discourse as the privileged or exclusive mode of communication for artistic research, which, of course, has its own contested terminologies. Is it something we do by, with, or through art? And these are arduous questions that people have spent dozens of pages on, and I'm not going to labor, but when people talk about practice-led or practice-informed or practice-based research, maybe they're just trying to get around the preposition quandary. Is it on, through, by, without, with? The Canadians have this magic term, it's like a magic wand, where they try to wave away the preposition dilemma by talking about research creation with a hyphen, recherche création. And it's really interesting because it works wonderfully for them, but it's not particularly meaningful for anybody else. So what that does, it's good that it works for them, and it allows them to position themselves in ways that mean that we can dialogue with it. But what that does is show, again, the context specificity of our terms, of where we're talking from. And, of course, we're talking about artistic research here in ways that are limited to Anglo-Saxon or Latin-based cultures. I'm omitting completely the very telling, I think, Wissenschaft and Forschung distinctions of German and of countries that have linguistic and cultural systems that I have absolutely no competence to address. So we are talking about something incredibly local and specific. The Danish philosopher, not being global, Søren Kierup, calls artistic research another way of knowing. So this is the first of the sensuous knowledge publication series that was initiated in 2004 by Johan Harburg up in Bergen. Just a brief Norwegian wood parenthesis. The sensuous knowledge publications and events are linked to the Norwegian Artistic Research Fellowship Program, which is really interesting. It was the first graduate came through in 2007, Trond Lucius. And this program has its own tensions, but it's very deliberately positioned itself as an artistic research fellowship rather than as something that's a doctoral award. And the Norwegians have thought very deeply about the specific kinds of knowledge or insights that are derived from artistic research. So Henk Borgdorf's debate on research in the arts, this was the second publication in the series, has been republished in his recent Conflict of the Faculties from 2013, which is a wonderfully informative work on artistic research in academia. And Henk works with the Society for Artistic Research and the Journal for Artistic Research with Michael Schwab, whose Rheinberger material I showed you earlier. And there's a fantastic conference coming up at the end of April in The Hague on artistic research with the theme of writing. So this is going to focus on the discursive practices surrounding artistic research. So SAR, the Society and the Journal, make quite a strong case for building publications, forms of publications that can accommodate artistic practices beyond text, beyond traditional text. Actually, Beyond Text was the name of a major multi-million-pound program in the UK to fund research that was meant to be beyond text, but of course, coming through a research council, the whole thing was driven by and ridden by text. So there's another key aspect of the legitimacy question, which relates back to development and professional recognition of artistic research, which is the question of its assessment, its evaluation, and its peer review system. Oh, this is a cheeky one. I don't know how many of you have given yourselves an Arty Bollocks generator certificate, but I thought you'd be reassured to know that my professorial qualifications are solidly backed by a certificate that you can download. So events like Sonic Acts are a vital peer review arena. Work is selected, it's experienced, it's discussed. But again, the problem that Harwood raises, where the film, the trace that served as a means of inquiry is looked on as an object, and it's looked on as an object by the output-hungry system as the artwork. This is a problem that, that really comes back with the validation question. It's like with Susan Shipley's workshops, which are an integral part of this academy. There's a focus, often and perhaps inevitably, on a residue or a trace of an activity, which can be immensely misleading because it can undermine or obscure the real relational values that have fired the inquiry process, which is the core of the artistic research. So as Christina Anderson says of systems of validation and recognition, I quote, "You're only as good as the last thing you did," meaning the last certifiably documented thing. So there are some artists who completely master the documentation system. It's almost a political mastery, like a presidential campaign. And indeed, they seem to design their research almost to place it centrally enough for it to be the document, to be a stand-in for the work. And then there are others, for example, some artists whose ephemeral live art forms like performance find themselves shortchanged because they haven't done this. They've spent all their time doing the actual work and not thinking about the documentation process. And in this instance, again quoting Christina, if their kick-ass performance isn't backed up by kick-ass documentation, then it doesn't exist. Because that would have required a completely different set of resources and a shift in focus. So this is a really strong question. And looking back at some of the stuff that we did at STEIM in the late 90s, there was a whole lot of stuff there that doesn't exist for the art world because it wasn't documented. It was ephemeral, it was exploratory, it was dangerous, and we weren't all running around with our iPhones taking photos of it. So it doesn't exist, right? There's another theme that recurs in this artistic research discussion, which is a theme of agency. How can artists reclaim their authority, strong word, as authors of a specific kind of work, from a system that so often muted them, authorizing official mediators to speak for them, to translate their efforts in non-risky ways, removing the danger of their exploratory energies, the Brakke Grond, and making them irrelevant, actually. This is a really weird kind of usurpation. And it calls to mind a situation that we faced back in the 70s and 80s in the environment I was in, setting up artist collectives and cooperatives like Kern. This is a place that I was associated with in Paris from the 70s through to the mid-80s. And these were resolutely anti-institutional places for original practice and reflection, for modes of conduct that could get away from the stifling constraints of conservative higher education and mainstream art, the gallery and curatorial system, art critics and specialist press. The price of our freedom was that members assumed the operating costs of these autonomous zones. They were more or less temporary according to how far we could bend ourselves to keep them running. And we had really interesting international connections. Obviously, this is thoroughly pre-internet. We were using faxes and phones and that strange thing called physical mail. We were linked to places all over the world, including V2 in its early Würtestraat days in Den Bosch. So we had basic practical needs, all of the structures of this kind, the collectives and cooperatives, which were spaces where we could meet and make and show and discuss work, means of identification and publication. We had a quarterly that was a platform for similar groups in Europe and Canada and Australia. And we were able to collectively buy resources as well, which we couldn't otherwise afford. So here's a piece of media archaeology. This is the stuff that we really broke ourselves to acquire. And we hosted visiting work from collectives and cooperatives with similar ethics. So this is a week-long event we did that nearly killed us in 1981. Grand Dieu épargnons cela, notre pays was a phrase famously invented by the then Minister of the Interior, Charles Pasqua, who was a very, very conservative man, I'll stay polite. And this was his comment with respect to free radio. So, of course, we took it as our slogan. But what was at least as important as the practical needs of places like this, if not more so, was the need for artists to be able to vouch for their own work, to sidestep the gallery system and self-proclaimed expertise of random critics who were competing for ways to leave their signatures on the pages of official cultural discourse. In the 70s and 80s, the curatorial forces around us were wildly out of sync with the emerging artistic landscape. And this made it all the more vital for artists to create means for voicing and testing their own terms. Of course, since then, many higher education institutions have refined their curatorial and critical practices and built some amazing programs to do this. But in some instances, these continue to overshadow, if not prescribe, the artistic research they claim to defend. Alternative scenes are often endorsed as a kind of a chic surrogate for the mainstream by supposedly informed, sympathetic mediators who are in fact just out for an easy ride, turning artistic practice into a palatable social commodity by removing its sting. I don't know whether people have... if you're mute readers, you probably know this, but Matt Fuller came up with a very trenchant review of the Whitechapel Gallery's electronic superhighway exhibition, which is dated kind of 2016, 1976 or something. And this is a tragicomic account of this curatorial libertarianism. It's all the more piquant given Matt's position at Goldsmiths, which I think is very reassuring because it confirms that it's possible, even though it's sometimes quite hard, to sustain critical, reflective, artistic research-related discourse within certain higher education contexts. So Matt calls the Whitechapel Exhibition an amazing feat of curation which maximizes its conceptual lifting power by illustrating how communications networks all point one way to our illustrious present. Such an exhibition sets the terms for a whole new range of curator skills for the coming season. This is the kind of ahistorical, pseudo-historical work that a lot of people are worried about. And this is why I think it's wonderful that we were able to see things like the commissioned Reimarker's piece yesterday and the work on Marianne Amacher. And there's a lot of deeply historically referenced work that I think we need to keep alive because of these kinds of things. Here's a few extracts from Matt's actual text. If you've got a lot of things in a room, put some years at the end of the exhibition title and drag unrelated work in to legitimate it. Looking like it might be a historical survey gives it gravitas. Curators have to take an ethical lesson from this. Don't just think the present is all about you. The past is as well. And the last paragraph, which is the kind of inside-outside thing, all of those who thought the networks provided a space outside the gallery, museum circuit, where other ways of working could come to the fore and play in and in between the established spaces for art, you were right. It's a space outside permanently. I have to confess I haven't yet seen the exhibition. I guess I kind of have to go. I kind of want to and don't want to. But I think the fact that there are new, exciting, relevant forms of curatorial intelligence around us and within this group and within this room doesn't basically remove the issues of these kinds of things, these kinds of organizations setting themselves up on completely questionable premises. And I think they have to be taken to task, as Matt does so beautifully. So he's denouncing, curiously, a gallery museum circuit that makes up the rules for what we see as artistic practice in a way that reminds me of the issues that we had in cooperatives and collectives in the 70s. We were trying to counter the same problem. But then coming full circle perhaps isn't so surprising, because research etymologically comes from the old French re for repetition or intensive force, and chercher, to search, which comes from the Latin cercare, to go around. So basically, in my very crass etymological translation, research means going around in circles, repeatedly and forcefully. So we're off to a good start. Generically, research is defined as a systematic investigation into and study of materials and sources to establish facts and reach new conclusions. I'm far from convinced that art as a means of engaging with the world aims to establish facts and reach new conclusions. This is a highly instrumentalized and prescriptive way of operating. Of course, artistic work may and does have a systematic and rigorous dimension. It's fiercely driven to open up perspectives that challenge our habitual views and relations, obliging us or allowing us to envisage new ones. But to do so, it's directly grounded in materialities and actions, more than in discursive or metadiscursive systems. It conjoins, while I'm on the etymology, the Latin roots of knowledge, sapere, which means to know, savoir, and to savor. So taste and knowing are part of the same thing. We lose this when we flip across to the English language. But if art leans towards other ways of knowing rather than establishing facts and reaching new conclusions, then it implements a distinctive kind of research. There's another risk here in looking at how we situate artistic research, which is in trying to better identify it and put it in its place, in the right place that makes it the kind of item we want to discuss, we have to be careful not to be undermining other terms by contrast. Scientific thinking like Reinberger's actually gives us some really interesting insights for artistic thinking. Experimental systems exteriorize spaces of the imagination. The main thrust of an experimental system is that it points beyond itself. And Reinberger is also wonderfully explicit about the fact that aesthetic processes carry a knowledge element and epistemic processes have aesthetic connotations. So I think it's really interesting to see where it is that these more scientifically grounded insights can serve us rather than trying to treat them as essentially oppositional, and at the same time ensuring that we're not subsuming them into artistic discourse. Bachelard, another philosopher of science who's a key figure for Reinberger, also talks about the instability of science in ways that are very similar to the ways that we might be talking about the arts as evolving, as emerging, as incredibly labile. Science doesn't crave unity. It doesn't seek simplicity or economy. Scientific progress is at its clearest when it gives up philosophical factors of easy unification. So this is kind of, this comes from 1938, it's not new, but, well, it's only recently been translated into English, but it's the kind of reasoning that I think we can take on board. Specifying, rectifying, diversifying, dynamic ways of thinking that escape certainty and unity. And homogeneous systems present obstacles rather than imparting momentum. The last phrase that I've hauled out of Bachelard is wonderful, but I should really put a kind of a health warning on it. I love this thing here. But actually, it's not very usable if I want to be academically credible and quote Bachelard properly, because he thoroughly denounces the use of metaphor. What he's talking about with his denunciation of purely verbal habits, he's talking about the need to engage pragmatically, the need to engage with experimental processes in a very real way. So I can't borrow that one as easily as I'd like to. But I think his insistence on the dynamics of exploratory and experimental processes is something that's useful for us, and it means that we have to think more deeply about how the particular dynamics and mobility of processes in experimental artwork and experimental art research might differ from what's being talked about here. So there's something kind of interesting about Bachelard. He talks about a chemist who designs a piece of apparatus by virtue of which we recognize a substance. What he's saying is that in order to identify a specific chemical substance, we have to come up with a set of assays, and we have to come up with a set of reproducible experimental procedures that prove that that substance exists. So the substance is a direct process, is a direct product of this revelation of this experimental system. And in a way, this seems to kind of dovetail with what Harwood says about the filmmaker taking the camera out into the field. The camera serves as a lens for revealing certain things, rather than as a vulgar recording apparatus. Or it dovetails with Christina Anderson's insistence on setting up systems that help us to pay attention, or make us pay attention. So, to enhance recognition of the specificities and complexities of artistic research, its specific relational qualities and modes, we have to be careful not to undermine the specificities and contingencies of other fields of research. We'll only be weakening our own case if we do that. And I know I'm preaching to the converted, so forgive me for hammering on about this, because I think events like the geologic imagination and the sorts of associations that Sonic Acts has been building over the years show that there has been a very cogent effort to try and create productive links across these different sectors. But these strike me as immensely important. Isabel Stengers condemns the behavior of so-called modern nomads who roam idly into different terrains without respecting the determinant attachments that they might represent for other people. And I should be acknowledging Ken Feingold, whose images I'm abusing as I work through this, as I go. But this question of actually feeling that we have the freedom, particularly perhaps in the artistic research world, we have the freedom just to idly latch onto stuff. Poetic license, certainly. Freedom, certainly. But thinking about how and why and what goes along with that. And Stengers is talking about respecting the attachments of those whose terrain we are roaming around and moving in on. So the problem is not with attachment. The problem may be that those of us who call themselves modern confuse their attachments with universal obligations, feeling free to define themselves as nomads, to enter any practical territory, to judge, deconstruct, or disqualify what appears to them as illusions or folkloric beliefs and claims. Stengers is actually talking in that text quite specifically about certain physicists who are kind of very jealous of their own territory and their attachments to their territories and their attachments to the methods and to the validation processes whereby they work in these territories. And she's saying this is a respectable thing. We need to respect it just as we are requesting respect for what it is that we're doing there. So she's talking about a kind of a conduct that recognizes the uniqueness of different practices and that can produce an experimental togetherness. So an ecology of practice is the title of the text, as you've seen, and it's the demand that no practice be defined as like any other. just as no living species is like any other. So you have to approach a practice as it diverges. You have to feel its borders, experiment with questions which practitioners from other areas may accept as relevant, even if they're not their own questions. This is kind of like what Christina was saying about needing to get ethics approval. You have to actually position what it is that you're doing in a way that is actually quite foreign and alien to what you would normally do. And that in itself can be very useful, can be pretty tedious too, I have to confess. So the problem for each practice is how to foster its own force and to make present what causes practitioners to think and feel and act. But it's a problem which may also produce an experimental togetherness among practices, dynamics of pragmatic learning of what works and how. I think these are kind of, for me, these are wonderful kind of lines of thinking and lines of conduct that are immensely valuable within the artistic research world. So there's another brief question I want to raise, which is how the critical positioning and energies of artistic research might contribute to our rethinking the tragedy of the commons through the privatization and commodification of knowledge. Research means building on the shoulders of giants. This systematic investigation builds on the systematic investigations of our precursors in traditional research terms. Then there is a problem that we're all aware of, which is the dependence of learning institutions on market-driven, contractualized research, locked down by proprietary publication and patent-controlled territories. This is something that's proving incredibly counterproductive. Or certainly, the tragedy of the commons is a good designation for it. And it's obviously something that needs to be taken up and that is taken up by the artistic research community. We're in a world where cognitive capital and immaterial labor, lazarato, being mobilized by artistic research in that curious thing that Pine and Gilmore call the experience economy. This is something that we have to carefully position. We're working on the borders of high return on investment sectors like the international contemporary art market. So the validation and review process is key. And looking at the open collaborative PreRevenue system that's been set up, for example, by Armin Medosh and Lisa Haskell, the next layer, I think can be quite useful. This is a resource for artist researchers trying to navigate arcane academic legitimation processes and what Dole Yoko, one of their bloggers, has called the commodification-driven edu-factory. So the artists are, I think we have a responsibility also to be thinking about the kinds of publications that we're engaging with or that we can literally afford to engage with. You know, probably the most vocal person in this area at the moment is Alexandra Elbakyan, who's she's in Kazakhstan, she's a neuroscientist, and she's just exploded the planet with proprietary scientific knowledge by invoking the United Nations Declaration of Human Rights, which is fantastic. Everyone has the right to freely participate in the cultural life of the community, to enjoy the arts and to share in scientific advancement and its benefits. So the arts are really core in this kind of thinking. And as Florian Schneider's put it, we can't just lament the decline of public institutions and the ongoing privatization of knowledge. We have to learn how to respond to that situation. And Florian's come up with this wonderful definition, this dates back quite some time, 2010, of institutions and exstitutions. The institutions which insist inequality of those who know and those who don't, and the exstitutions exist. Their main purpose is to come into being and to grant automatic and simultaneous and systematic knowledge access to all. So the dilemmas that both of these face, and Florian makes it clear that these two types of entities can't mix. They're not hybrids, but they're opposites. At the same time, there's a grey area between them that's strategically very important. It's a border economy zone where actors can switch back and forth from institution to exstitution, profiting from the sharpness of their boundaries. So it's a grey area with sharp boundaries. There's some quite interesting mixes in the metaphors there. But I think with respect to the Sonic Acts Academy, we have to work out Are we talking about an exstitutional or an institutional type practice? What kind of place, what kind of legacy does this academy want to inherit or to leave? And this is the academy. This is the proprietary academy. This is the 1648 Académie Royale de Peinture. Things that are patented and controlled by the king. This is Science Academy, lots of these as well. Arts and sciences and humanities have traditionally been rolled together in academies. Academy Awards, Sonic Acts Academy Awards. And of course, academies bear on all kinds of professional sectors, military academies. So is this the kind of academy that we're talking about? I said I wouldn't talk about academies, but I couldn't resist it. But this is the one I find really interesting. The original academy. Academos was a Greek who actually bequeathed his land, which he owned, outside the city walls in the north of Athens, to the citizens so that they could enjoy it and do their gymnastics there and collectively think and talk there. So body and mind went wonderfully together in this climatically friendly part of the world. And the grove, the olive grove in this place was dedicated to Athena, the goddess of wisdom. So there are all kinds of really interesting links there. But the Academos, this thing was named Academy after him, after he'd given it to his Athenian fellows. It then became Plato's Academy, where Plato lectured and founded the philosophical tradition of skepticism, drawing largely on the promotion of group discussion and problem solving, dialectics. So maybe this gives us a really rich legacy and clue for what we might be doing here, making the best of multiple voices, resources, trajectories, and methods, positioning ourselves as a prerequisite for dialogue. We've chosen to be here, which means that we've chosen not to be somewhere else, including people up there. And we need to work out on what grounds we want to maintain what position here. So we're all linked in very different ways to art research and to various kinds of institutions, educational, cultural, whatever. And Sonic Act's own positioning and the kind of work it supports and commissions means that there's a very rich cross-section of people here, which means that our collective experience can be a resource that we can mobilize to get beyond the existing discussions on artistic research by tuning to each other and to our specificities. And I've had quite a few feisty women in these slides, but I thought I'd finish. Oh, that was the Plato Academy. Yes, sorry. And of course, Plato is there in the middle with the younger Aristotle. Plato modeled on Leonardo, of course. So, it was a place you can see. They're all chatting away. Here's somebody I wanted to finish with. The wonderful Hannah Arendt. The more people's standpoints I have in mind while I'm pondering a given issue, and the better I can imagine how I would feel and think if I were in their place, the stronger will be my capacity for representative thinking, and the more valid my final conclusions, my opinion. So I will leave it at that and hope that this has been enough of a provocation and a justification for an ongoing conversation. Thank you.